Go. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. This is Jonathan from Nimonik. Very happy that you joined us here today for ESG and Compliance. Where do we go from here? Just a webinar on the current state of affairs and how compliance underpins ESG. So we're gonna give everybody just a couple minutes to get started, to get a coffee or go to the washroom, and we'll get started in just 2 minutes. More and more people are joining the webinar. Some housekeeping items while we wait. There are some handouts, PDFs of presentations in the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side. We're going to do 3 polls throughout this webinar, just to get a sense of who's on the call and what you've been working on. If you have a question during the webinar, please don't hesitate to put that into the questions panel on the right-hand side. The GoToWebinar system has a questions panel, and we will get to your questions either during the webinar or at the end, depending on the question. I apologize for some of the emails that went out. There was a couple that were using old content from a previous webinar we had done, and we hadn't realized a certain setting in the system. So I apologize for that confusion, but this webinar today is indeed on ESG and the state of compliance. So we'll get started in just 30 seconds, and this webinar will be recorded and the video will be shared with you tomorrow. So if you have to leave or if you want to share it with colleagues or other people, you can expect to see that video tomorrow. So let's give everybody just 30 seconds to get set up, grab that glass of water, and we'll get started very, very shortly. Thank you. Okay, great. So let's get started. Today's agenda is going to be reviewing the 2021 State of Compliance survey that Nimonik conducted over the last few months, a discussion of ESG trends, where we came from and where we're headed, and then a bit of a discussion on how does compliance underpin ESG. So very glad that so many people could join us from all around the world, from fantastic organizations. I think we have people representing a variety of different businesses and government as well. Before we get into this specific agenda, I just want to provide a little bit of context about Nimonik, who we are, what we do. Hopefully that will frame a little bit where we're coming from. So let me jump to the beginning of this presentation. And we got about 5 slides just to talk about Nimonik. It's not a sales pitch, but I just want to give you some context as to how we think about compliance. So Nimonik was started in 2008, and we service about 450 organizations around the world. Here are some more of the better known ones, and we help them stay on top of their compliance issues and obligations. I guess one thing I like to explain is what Nimonik is not. Often we like to put different companies into different boxes, for better or for worse, but Nimonik is not an EHS management software. So we're not like Intelex or Enablon or companies like that. We don't just provide you with content, and we don't just provide you with an audit tool. What we're trying to offer you is a system, an approach, and a tool that helps you improve your compliance maturity. So we want to help all the companies we work with and government move from this reactive side of the spectrum to the proactive side. So get ahead of the curve, understand what you have to stay in compliance with, and at the end of the day, reduce surprises. Because what we've seen all around the world with all sorts of organizations, big and small, old and new, is that the vast majority of organizations do not know all of their obligations. They don't know everything they need to do based on the laws, regulations, rules, and standards that apply to them. And this ends up leading to surprises. And of course, those surprises cost time and money. And what we've seen over the years is that a typical manufacturing facility or heavy industry facility has about 3,000 compliance obligations and at least 200 new ones per year. These are new standards, new regulations that are coming out. So staying on top of this in an organized and disciplined manner is a challenge. But ultimately what we do is we believe that modern organizations can operate efficiently and satisfy their customers without these violations, these spills, product recalls, or worker injuries. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about making the company more efficient and better run. And I think this has a lot to do with ESG, and we'll get into the details a little bit further down the road. But a lot of ESG is about avoiding these types of problems before they ever occur. And so we do this with an approach called comprehensive compliance. And what does that really mean? It's that we work with you to look across various compliance areas. So in the case of ESG, we're talking about social, environmental, and governance issues. If you want to come into compliance with ESG standards, or if you want to come into compliance with laws and regulations, we help you map out everything that you want and need to come into compliance with. We can also do other areas like safety and product. And then we look across all these different sources. So there's regulations from government standards, your internal contracts and permits, stakeholder engagements and customer commitments you've made. So we want to look across all these documents, organize them, structure them, and then enable you to have timely management of actions and audits. So really it's these three key pieces that we do is obligations, all the external ones coming from regulators, standards bodies, ESG bodies, the internal ones from your own engagements, your files, your permits, your procedures, then help you create actions and receive actions when these things change, and then conduct audits and inspections to make sure your operations are constantly in compliance. So the last slide before we jump into the core of the presentation today, at the end of the day, we want to make organizations more resilient. And I think ESG is a lot about that. ESG is about helping you build a more sustainable organization, a more resilient organization. And so we get all your obligations in one place. That way you have 360-degree coverage, both the mandatory ones and the voluntary ones, which, such as ESG, in some cases are voluntary. We map those to your internal systems and ensure you're always ready for an audit. Too many companies still use audits as a driver for their compliance efforts, where we believe that audits are really there as a spot check, a bit like a pop quiz. And if you've done your homework, the pop quiz is not a problem, right? The audit's not a problem. And so we want to have you focus on performance improvements and ultimately increase the trust with your staff, your partners, your suppliers, but also in the case of ESG, with investors. That's where ESG is coming from. We'll talk about that in more detail. And we want to reduce risk and ultimately less surprises. So that's a little bit of summary of what Nimonik, or who Nimonik is and what we do. Hopefully that provides a bit of context about how we think about ESG. So the agenda for today is a discussion of the results from the 2021 State of Compliance Survey. The full report is available on our website on the resources page, and I've attached it in the GoToWebinar handout. So you can go and download the full report. I've included highlights in today's presentation. We're then going to discuss a little bit ESG trends, where we're coming from, where we're going, and then how does compliance interact and underpin ESG. And hopefully some of this information will help you think about your programs and systems and plans around ESG. So first, 2021 State of Compliance Survey. So what is this survey? We do this survey every year. And because compliance is a moving target, we believe no organization is fully compliant with all of its obligations. It's frankly almost impossible. So you have these mandatory obligations and voluntary ones, and we want to ensure that all of it is in one location. So really, when we think about obligations, we're thinking about internal and external. The external ones come from governments, standards. Internal ones are ones that you give yourself. And so we pull that all into one system. And if you achieve that, that's what we think high level of compliance looks like. So in addition to the actual regulations and standards and everything changing, the organization itself is of course changing. And so this is an ongoing struggle. So what we did is we surveyed 150 industry professionals, mostly in EHS risk compliance space, at mid-market companies. So when we say mid-market companies, these are companies between 500 and 15,000 employees, or if you think in market capitalization, between 1 billion and 45 billion market capitalization approximately. So the summary of the survey, and I'll go into a little bit more detail afterwards, is that most organizations feel their compliance burden is going to continue to increase. I don't think this is a big surprise for anybody, but most organizations felt that they were fairly well equipped to tackle it. A portion of our respondents were Chinese companies. We have an office in Shanghai and work with many companies that are either Chinese companies or foreign companies in China. And Chinese companies had a lot more concern around fines, penalties, and sanctions than their North American or European counterparts. And I think you can see this in the data. We published a couple things about Chinese fines and penalties dramatically increasing in the last few years. And I think that trend will likely continue. Almost all organizations felt that they could use more resources to tackle compliance, and this was especially true in China, where they felt they were understaffed. And the other thing that really stood out in this survey is that pretty much all the organizations lost substantial time and money on surprises. And these losses were often in the thousands of hours and millions of dollars. So this is perhaps one of the biggest opportunities for savings and for a return on investment in your compliance program, is reducing these surprises and making that business case to the appropriate people. So as I mentioned, we surveyed mostly mid-market companies, about 60% of the respondents, and then about 12% were bigger than that, and then 28% were smaller organizations. So most organizations agreed, with our own assessment that they have about 2,500 obligations and about 4% change every year. The data we have is based on 450,000 regulatory documents and standards around the world. And in our data, we see that there's an average of about 3.5% change every year. 3.5% of these documents, these obligations, are repealed, replaced, new ones come into place, or they're amended every year. So it's a substantial amount of change. 3.5% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about thousands of obligations, it does add up. And then most of these organizations felt that about 30% of their obligations came from internal documents, so contracts, permits, ESG engagements, stakeholder engagements, and they felt that they were not being managed that effectively. We did a survey in 2021 specifically on internal obligations, and this is an ongoing challenge for a lot of organizations due to silos, different systems, different people. So it's an ongoing challenge. Organizations had a fairly high level of confidence that they're mostly in compliance, but they didn't necessarily have really great data to support that. I've heard all sorts of stories over the years of legal departments relying on newsletters or things of that nature. So there's a general feeling like, yeah, we're in compliance, but the data to support it is not always there. So this is just a slide on what we discussed. So about, the majority of the companies felt that they were in the 500 to 2,000 range of obligations, and some felt they had less. My suspicion is the ones that feel that they have less just haven't done a full survey of everything that they have to do, but this was what the respondents said. So in terms of management systems, most organizations have some form of a compliance program in place, but Chinese and European companies rely a lot more on certified or structured management systems than North American companies, a lot more ISO certification in Europe and Asia than in Canada, US, or Mexico. And that technology for managing compliance is still not very widespread. Even in leading companies, almost 50% of the companies are either using a combination of pen, paper, Word, and Excel, which is pretty impressive in a certain sense. And generally speaking, most companies were satisfied with their systems, but the Chinese companies really stood out as being not happy with the systems they have in place. And that might be, one hypothesis is that that's because when we say Chinese companies, we're including foreign companies that have operations in China or joint ventures. And of course, sometimes the systems that are provided by corporate aren't necessarily suited to a Chinese context. And so there's frustration on behalf of these subsidiaries. And in terms of prioritization, risk ranking is growing in terms of it's a use to classify obligations. But Chinese companies really rely on the potential fines and government inspections to determine which regulations they should be keeping on top of. And the other finding, in the management system section is that many organizations are still audit driven, meaning they rely on external and internal audits to drive their compliance programs. This is really not ideal because an audit is never perfect and it's never the same. Different auditors have different sort of perspectives or biases. And so you don't want to use audits as your driver, but that is what most or many organizations are doing. And so yeah, here talking about how do they prioritize their compliance initiatives. You can see the red is Chinese organizations, and they put a lot more emphasis on government audits, potential fines, whereas European and North American companies focus a bit more on risk ranking, audit reports, and other elements. So perception of compliance. So the survey respondents indicated that in general, there's a pretty positive view of compliance in the sense of like it's viewed as an investment by the organization. Now, there's a good chance that there's a bit of a bias in the respondents to the survey, that the people who respond to the survey tend to be from organizations that are already forward thinking, that are already investing in ESG and compliance. So we should take this with a bit of a grain of salt. But most participants did feel that compliance is part of operational excellence, which is a good sign. So companies are understanding that by avoiding these surprises, putting in place compliance programs, you're improving your operations, your efficiency. And I think we already mentioned that most organizations feel they still lack resources to tackle this properly. And the shortage was particularly acute amongst Chinese companies. So yeah, both, over 60% of respondents felt that compliance is viewed as both a cost and an investment at the organization, which is, I think, good. Again, we should take this with a bit of grain of salt. And in terms of do they have enough staff to manage compliance, China has indicated that they don't have enough, basically, and whereas other companies felt that they had just enough. So one of the big findings of this survey was that companies still feel they have way too many surprises, and there's still a lot of room for improvement. So they couldn't necessarily quantify the amount of time spent on unplanned events, but one person's quoted as saying it was a heck of a lot of time. So one spill, one issue, one media article, it can just create huge amounts of work for staff and therefore money and time. So it's really critical that organizations get ahead of the curve here and figure out what's causing these unplanned events and how can they use a compliance program, ESG and others to avoid them. And if they can quantify the cost of these unplanned events, I think that's an important step in building a business case for your organizations. Because almost all the organizations surveyed said that they could have avoided a substantial portion of these surprises with better systems and planning. And I think that's the ongoing challenge here is making sure you put in those systems and planning to avoid surprises, and then make sure you have the data to support that so that you can justify your budgets to the appropriate people. So how much time was spent on surprises? And these are, individual respondents. So just one person within the organization. So we had most people were somewhere between 11 and 1,000 hours in 2020. And then of course, if you multiply this by the number of people in the organization and what have you, it's substantial. So emerging trends, the vast majority of organizations see the regulatory and compliance burden increasing. I think this is, we talked a bit about this at the beginning of the presentation. It's not a surprise. Most organizations feel they have good tools in place, but there's opportunity to continue to invest and improve those systems. And I think the conclusion that we draw for this, which was part of the inspiration for doing this webinar today, was that ESG, so environmental, social, and governance, is becoming an increasingly important part of compliance programs. And most organizations plan to further integrate their ESG with their compliance systems. So I think over 67% of people said they're planning to add environmental, social, and governance elements to their compliance systems in the upcoming year. And so I think, just in conclusion, A lot of people commented on the need to centralize and organize data. They need to create a holistic system where you can manage all your compliance needs. And right now, most organizations have a variety of different systems. They're tracking data related to, in this case, the person mentioned health, safety, and environment. And it's really important that top-level management is involved and believes in compliance. We've seen situations at Nimonik of customers where top-level management change for a variety of different reasons, and all of a sudden compliance completely dropped off the radar. So top-level management is critical, and you really need to embed a culture of compliance in the organization if you want it to stick through all the staff changes that are inevitably going to happen. And you want to get that enterprise-wide commitment from all levels of the organization. So it can't just be management. There also needs to be people who support the implementation and the operation of the systems. And so most respondents felt that obligations are going to continue to increase, especially from customers. And I would put into this category as well things from investors and partners. ESG is going to take on a greater and greater role, and other participants felt that there's going to be a significant increase in both state and federal regulations within the U.S. But I think that comment is pertinent to pretty much every jurisdiction around the world. So that's a quick summary of the state of compliance. Really what I learned from it is that people are still being surprised by events that cost a lot of time and money, and that everybody pretty much is expecting an increase in the regulatory burden and an increased importance on ESG. Again, before we jump into the second part of this presentation, please, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to clarify, please put that into the comments section of the webinar, and we'll get to those at the end. We do have a couple polls, so let me launch the first poll, which is about surprises, because that was one of the main things we learned from this survey. So do compliance surprises take a substantial amount of your time? So if you could answer this poll, and we'll share the results with everybody in just a minute, give everybody a minute to vote. But one issue that I've seen with people over the years is that they're in positions where they have to balance, they're tasked with dealing with surprises and problems, and they're also tasked with having proactive role in terms of improving compliance and improving the performance of their the teams and parts of the business that they operate in. So you have this real challenge of balancing, like, I got to put out this fire with I got to put in place a system that prevents the fire from ever happening again. And I think that sort of split personality disorder, if you will, is a real challenge for a lot of people. And these surprises can eat into your time dramatically. All right, let's give everybody just a couple more seconds to vote in this poll, and then I'll close it and share the results. All right, great. So let me close the poll, and I'm just going to share the results. So here we see that over 78% of respondents said that yes, surprises take a substantial amount of their time. And this aligns with what we saw in the survey and what we've seen operating Nimonik for about 12 years. And we really want to help you reduce this. That's I think the big challenge that a lot of folks are facing. Let me hide this. All right, great. So let's go into ESG. So this summary slide, just from our consulting group, I thought was good. ESG is about environmental, social, and governance. So it's about how does the company perform as a steward of nature, minimizing your impact on the environment, whether that's climate change, waste management, resource depletion. The social element, how does the company manage its relationship with employees, suppliers, customers, and the community? So it's everything from how you treat your own staff to suppliers. I remember discussing with an automotive parts company which OEM, which assembler they like doing work with the most, and without hesitating, they said, we love working with Toyota, because when Toyota sets you up as a supplier, they give you very clear specifications on what they want, and everything is done really, properly. Whereas some of the other assemblers would change the specifications, would change the contracts. It would just be a lot of work. So that was interesting. I think the way you treat your suppliers matters in terms of your business health. So one just small story there. And then governance. So it deals with how a company is governed, and this is everything from executive pay, shareholder rights, board diversity, audits, etc. So a little bit of, I always like to look at the history of things. I think that gives us perspective on where we came from and potentially where we're going. So ESG, the term is a more recent term, but the general concept of making businesses and organizations more progressive and dealing with these various elements of environmental and social and governance, I think starts back in the 1960s, after the war. In the 1960s, we started seeing these anti-war protests, May 69, which led to some initial initiatives to encourage businesses to behave in a certain way. And so we saw Pax World, Business and Society Index, and then eventually a code of conduct against apartheid in South Africa. And this was in the 1960s. 1970s, we saw Earth Day was created in the US. The Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act were brought into force, very massive pieces of legislation. 1980s was, the US regulated against South Africa in terms of Anti-Apartheid Act. And that was probably a turning point in some sense, certainly for South Africa. 1989, the famous Exxon Valdez spill led to the coalition of environmentally responsible companies, and in many ways, even Exxon Mobil took that disaster and dramatically transformed their business in terms of compliance and management of risk. 1990 saw the launch of the first social index of companies that were considered to be progressive, so the Domini 400. 92, we had the Earth Summit in Rio, which led to a number of things. 1997 saw the launch of the GRI, so Global Reporting Initiative. And in 2000, the Global Compact, which is a UN initiative for companies that are signing up to behave in a more sustainable and progressive manner, was created. And so between the 90s and today, we saw a whole variety of ISO standards that were management systems and other systems that companies adopted. So 14,001 for environment, 45,000 for health and safety, 19,600 for compliance, and 31,000 for risk. And of course, there's many others. But these standards were sort of a cementing of this evolution of thinking of how businesses should be run. And so the inflection point in terms of when we see ESG really appearing as a term on the map was in 2005 with a paper that came out of the UN, said who cares wins. And so ESG investing is really based on the assumption that ESG factors have financial relevance. I think this is a big shift. Certain activists and other groups over that period we just covered of the 1960s to 2000s tried to impose some forms of moralistic, like this business is good or this business is bad. Whereas ESG is really about saying, no, if you manage environment, social, and governance properly, you will have a better financial outcome, regardless of any sort of moral position on this. And so there's been a whole variety of standards and reporting that's been implemented over the last since 2005. I listed a few here. This is not exhaustive. The big challenge for, the quote that I found interesting was the big challenge for most corporations to adapt to a new environment that favors smarter, cleaner, and healthier products and services, and to leave behind the dogmas of an industrial era when pollution was free, labor was just a cost factor, and scale and scope was the dominant strategy. So for investors, ESG data is increasingly important to identify those companies that are well positioned for the future and to avoid those which are likely to underperform or fail. And I think we see this across the board in almost every industry. The companies that have adopted to this new reality are the ones that are thriving, that are finding access to capital, that are growing. And so a couple other inflection points, even more recently in May 2017, 62% of Exxon Mobil shareholders went against management's recommendation and voted that the world's largest oil and gas company should report on the impacts of climate change to its own business. and this was an increase of 38% over the previous year. So I think, when the world's largest oil and gas company is being pushed by its own shareholders to include the impacts of climate change on its business, we know that there's been serious buy-in by mainstream investors, right? We're not talking about a small business. We're not talking about some sort of business run by, very progressive out there people. This is Exxon Mobil. And so we saw the Business Roundtable report on ESG in 2019, the Davos Manifesto 2020, which was the universal purpose of a company. And what that does is it really shifts the idea that a company is there to make profit to the idea that the company is there to achieve a wider set of objectives, including environment, social, and governance. And then Larry Fink, famed investor, cited in his letter this year that there's been, due to COVID, that there's really been a tectonic shift for companies. Companies now have no choice but to move in this direction, or else they'll be left behind in terms of investment opportunities and growth. So yeah, ESG is fundamentally about the financial health of an organization. It's not a moralistic judgment on what the business does. It's really about, if you do these things, if you take care of your employees, if you take care of the environment, if you govern your business properly, you're going to have a better financial outcome. Mike Wallace, partner at Environmental Resources Management, which is the world's largest environmental consulting group, he explained that, this can seem confusing and overwhelming, but it's really a logical progression of our field's evolution and thinking. And I think we saw that in that, the history slide of 1960s today. This didn't happen overnight. This has been a long and progressive change, and new issues are emerging. The breadth and depth of our impacts are better understood. The science also has dramatically improved, and all, we being like citizens, shareholders, investors, everybody wants to know more about what a company is doing to improve its or reduce its impact and improve its impact on the world. So this World Economic Forum framework, what it does is it brings together a whole variety of environmental, governance, and social issues. And this summary provided by Betsy Atkins, I think, was quite good. I'll share the slides with everybody afterwards. But these are the broad categories that all ESG people need to be thinking about. And there's no one size fits all. There's no solution that's going to help you tackle all of this at the same time. But this is really the scope of what companies need to be thinking about. And another challenge for sure is the amount of data and reporting that's being asked by ESG investors is substantial and potentially creates some challenges. So here are just some examples of frameworks that people are using around ESG and then the rating agencies. So as an organization, it's very challenging to tackle all of this at the same time. And hopefully there will be some consolidation and streamlining of this in the next few years. But ESG has remained, I'd say, up until now, still very reporting driven. And the operational impacts that ESG has had have been limited, but I expect those to grow substantially in the next few years. There's a couple slides on financial growth. There's been a tremendous growth, both in terms of the amount of assets that are being managed, ESG mandated. So here these are in the US. So by 2025, we expect about half of all assets that will be managed will be ESG related, 34.5 trillion, which is a lot. And then this graph on the right hand side shows a broader worldwide coverage. So we're already up to about $100 trillion in assets managed around the world, globally. And then the other argument that's often made, and I think it's true, is that ESG investments are outperforming non-ESG investments. And there's a couple examples here. Devil's always in the details, but generally speaking, if you look at the stock market and where the money has gone, it's been in this direction. And so just another chart on the amount of assets that are being placed into ESG related investments, and it's substantial. So just from 2012 to 2018, which is already about 2-3 years ago, it almost tripled. And Europe is ahead of the curve here. They've implemented more regulations, more requirements. And I think if we want to see where the rest of the world's going to go in the next few years, look at Europe. Energy regulation, board diversity requirements, that is going to come to Asia, US, Canada, and other places. So conclusion in terms of the trends in ESG, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, set up a task force in 2021, and they're likely to publish a more formal ESG framework next year. So expect that to come out and have a big impact. It's important that we all follow these, keep an eye on these trends and ideally get ahead of them. I think there's no denying that ESG will continue to grow. Hopefully there'll be some consolidation of standards and reporting requirements to make everybody's life a little bit easier. But really it's about putting in place some monitoring systems to track relevant changes to the requirements you have under ESG and other elements, because it's only going to grow. And so relying on newsletters or siloed solutions is definitely going to be a challenge. And so I think the other message is, regardless of the requirements you have or the standards you're trying to meet, I think ESG itself is just a sound business strategy. It's something that's going to help make your business more attractive to employees. It's going to make your business run better. And so there's no reason really not to do this. So you need to put in systems put systems in place to help you manage this. But first, take the time to determine your organization's priorities. You can't do everything at once. That slide that listed 14 or so areas of work, it's important that you take the time to figure out which of these are the priority for your organization based on your context. Okay, great. So that was a bit of a discussion of ESG trends, where we're coming from and where we're headed. Hope this was helpful for everybody. Please, again, feel free to put in questions into the questions panel. And I'll just take a bit of water here. Let me launch. We have a second poll. So let me put this second poll in. So the second poll is, are you involved in ESG efforts at your organization? So what's your level of involvement in ESG efforts? Are you leading? Are you just involved in one form or another, or you're not involved at all and you're kind of just curious about this shift in the business landscape? So we'll give everybody just a minute here to respond to the poll, and then I'll share the results with everybody. All right, great. So the vote count is increasing. Let's give another 30 seconds to complete this, and then I will close the poll and share it. All right, so let me close this and share it. So we have about 30% of people are leading the ESG efforts at their organizations, 45% are involved, and then 23% are not involved. And so we do have a lot of leaders here and a lot of people who have to actually implement this. So hopefully we're providing some helpful information today. All right, let me hide the poll. All right, great. All right, so the last section that we want to cover today was, how does compliance underpin ESG? So the way I like to think about compliance is rules, regulations, standards, things that have been put in place by government or standards bodies, industry associations, or even things you've given yourself as rules. They're there to force organizations to do what they would not otherwise do. We don't need a regulation to tell you to do something that you would normally do. So really, if we're honest, it's that these rules and regulations and standards are there to force us to do things we would not otherwise do, and hopefully move the company and society in the right direction. And I think rules and regulations can be looked at from different perspectives, and ESG is a standard, or a series of standards, I should say. And so we should look at it always from the customer or public perspective. We should look at it from our competitors' perspective, like, does adhering to this standard or this rule make us more competitive, make us a better business, and what are our competitors doing? And then certainly we have to look at things from the regulator's perspective, or in the case of ESG, from the investment community's perspective. And so to getting these three perspectives together and then determining how you should tackle a specific requirement makes it a lot more effective. It ensures that you do what's required in a more holistic way and avoid a simple tick the box exercise where you're saying, oh, we put in place a policy, we're compliant to this. But if you really look at it from these three perspectives, you can understand, well, this policy from the point of view of the from the employees, it means this, and from the point of view of the regulators, it means this. So we really recommend looking at it in these three ways. And there is an ongoing trend around the world to impose more responsibility on companies, directors, and managers. So things like environmental spills, harassment issues, diversity issues, etc. There's more and more responsibility being placed on companies, directors, and managers. So getting ahead of the curve and understanding the perspective of the public. When you think about a PR nightmare or the perspective of a regulator in terms of fines, penalties, and sanctions, even criminal proceedings is critical here. And so, yeah, I think ESG, what it really does is trying to bring together obligations from these different areas, environment, social, and governments, in a more holistic vision that's aligned with the financial interests of a company and society. And that, to a certain extent, is probably why it's been more successful than some other initiatives over the years, because it's really trying to bring together many things, but at the same time, ensuring they're aligned with the financial interests of the company. And so really what we think is compliance is a foundation on top of which you build your house. And you can run, but you cannot hide. So you can be reporting to these ESG standards, you can be filling in all the boxes, but if you're not doing the underlying work of making sure you're in compliance with the rules, regulations, and standards, you're eventually going to get caught. And so MSCI, which is an investment agency, they're using AI to try and uncover undisclosed data, which informs their ratings of ESG for different companies. So the tools are getting more sophisticated. The organizations that are rating and regulating and putting out standards are getting more sophisticated. So you can't fake it. I mean, well, you can, but not for very long. And we saw another comment from FCA, which is we're going to challenge firms where we see evidence of potential greenwashing. They're going to clarify their expectations and carry out further policy analysis. And I think the SEC's task force on ESG is a lot about that. There's been a certain amount of greenwashing that's been done over the years. And when the SEC gets involved, it's pretty serious business, right? So I think you're going to see more and more rigorous analysis of what companies are doing and digging below just these glossy ESG reports. So the transition, in our opinion, you need to be taking your compliance programs and stop thinking about them simply as a defensive mechanism, protecting yourself against fines, penalties, and issues, and using compliance as an offense. So using compliance as a way to drive change within your organization. When you say, we're trying to reach these ESG objectives that we've set for ourselves, and we want to make sure we're in compliance down the entire stack, so all the way from the board down to the operations. And you can really use that as a tool to motivate people, to organize your workforce, and to drive change. Compliance should not just be a defense, it really needs to be your offense. And you got to put in place the systems and collect the data to be able to stand up to scrutiny down the road. So yeah, it's about getting ahead of the curve. I mean, reporting and transparency requirements are only going to increase. Now with AI and different technologies, it's easier and easier to analyze vast amounts of data. So you got to implement a comprehensive compliance program and relevant solutions. And I just want to make a side note here and say, like, software is not the solution. Software is a tool. Really, it's about an organizational structure, an organizational change, getting buy-in and showing the value. Then you should buy the appropriate tools, whether it's Nimonik or some other solution, to execute. But you got to get that transparency going. And the chief sustainability and ESG officer at the law firm, Paul Weiss, said the natural place for ESG to reside is the compliance department, if you have, depending on your company and what you have in place, because compliance does have a systems, process, software, GRC platforms, and the like. So it is a great place to track, monitor, and report. and it's the only function that has really enterprise-wide visibility and process in place. The one challenge I've seen, at least with compliance departments, is that they often don't dive down into the nitty-gritty details. So they'll ask questions like, okay, are we in compliance on the environmental issues? Yes. Okay, thank you. Done. Whereas really what you need to do is you need to drive down into like, are we in compliance with all the specific requirements, whether it's waste management, air emissions, etc., and then have all that data handy to show to internally and eventually externally. So that's, a word of caution is compliance departments are a good place to start, but you're going to need to find a way to drive this throughout the whole organization. And data is key. So, outside parties are going to be looking with more and more scrutiny. Do you have a policy or procedure in place? Can you track and measure and monitor and report on progress against that initiative? So it's not sufficient anymore just to say, yeah, we have a procedure on how to handle hazardous materials. So you got to show that it was actually used, executed, that there's a paper trail. And one oil and gas company we work with, they did a survey. So they were looking to improve their compliance programs and to get ahead of the curve because they had received a number of fines and issues over the years. And so they started by doing a survey of other oil and gas and industrial companies that they knew. And they found that everybody had something in place, but no one does compliance in exactly the same way. All the leading companies have something in place, but no one does it in the exact same way, which it doesn't surprise me, but it's interesting. And so it's really important that you find the right solution for your organization. And there is no one size fits all, but the fundamentals is data, data, data. You got to get that data going. Another mining company that we were having discussions with recently, they're over 100 years old, this mining company. They've been operating various mines for many, many years. But recently they came under pressure from the board to provide data on their compliance status. They were going out looking for capital on the stock market. And the investors were saying, okay, well, show us that you have an ESG program in place, show us that you have an environmental controls in place, which is, at the end of the day, a question of risk for the investors. And they weren't able to provide very good data. They were able to say, well, we haven't received any fines. But the absence of fines doesn't necessarily indicate that you have a robust system in place. So they came to us and, they're looking to implement a more robust compliance program so that they can eventually report up and produce the evidence that they are controlling their risk and that the investors should give them the money to build the mine or expand the mine. So ESG compliance implementation challenges. So all this sounds nice. It's easy for me to say this sitting in my office, but how do you actually drill down into the details without overwhelming your staff? This is always been a big challenge. The short answer is like automation. You got to minimize the amount of data that the staff need to enter and rather try and automate it and link it up with existing systems and procedures. How do you balance point solutions versus enterprise-wide software? So it's often tempting, especially at the top of an organization, to just buy one system that's going to do everything, whether that's SAP, Oracle, Enablon, or something like that. And that can be a very expensive endeavor. And the challenge with any enterprise-wide software is it's often not very good at these small specific issues. So I think the way I always recommend it is think about the data that you're looking to obtain, thinking about the resources you have to collect that data, and then determine the appropriate solutions. It might be a mobile auditing app, it might be some automated sensors, and then collect all that data and have a system that allows you to bring it all together, a business intelligence solution. Because there's no enterprise-wide software that's going to help you tackle all of these issues. That much I'm certain of. Then the question is, can you play offense with ESG? Can you use ESG to drive change in your organization, considering there's always limited resources and there is legitimate resistance to change? There's people in your organization that say, why are we changing? That's been working well. So you got to really use ESG and build up the business case to drive that change. It's not easy, but I think there's more and more evidence that companies that embrace ESG and that get ahead of the curve on compliance are the ones that are going to succeed in this market. So in conclusion, I think each organization needs to set their own ESG objectives that take into account the evolving landscape that we've discussed today, the organization itself, its culture, its history, and the underlying business that you're in. You can't just take these ESG items there when it come into compliance with everything. It really needs to be contextualized to your organization. Compliance to standards, policies, procedures, and regulations are at the core of progress. I mean, if I could spend another webinar just talking about the history of regulatory change around EHS, but really, without the standards and policy and procedures that have been introduced over the last, let's just say 100, 150 years around the world, the world would be a very different place. So this is progress, as annoying and frustrating as it can sometimes be to get all these new standards and policies you have to come into compliance with. But really, this is just how it is. And so organizations need to start their journey by figuring out what applies to them. Are they in compliance? And if they're not in compliance, how can they come into compliance? And too often the journey is started with reporting and audits, and this turns into a whack-a-mole exercise. So very often what happens, and we've seen this, is that companies get an external audit and they say, oh, the auditor found this finding, or the auditor did this, and we got to solve that problem. So they go out and they solve that problem. And then next year they have another audit, and an auditor finds a completely different thing that should have been picked up in the previous audit, but it wasn't, because the auditor is different, their approach is different. And this is similar with like ESG reporting. Is often one reporting agency puts more emphasis on one thing than another one. So it becomes a whack-a-mole exercise, and very frustrating. And so what we recommend is really taking this comprehensive view. Let's take the time to look at all of our requirements across all these different things, contextualize it to the business, prioritize it, and then work on it. And then hopefully your reporting and your auditing become routine, easy things to do. That's really what we think makes for a successful implementation of this. And ensure, just to reinforce this point, is ensure that you have visibility on all of your obligations before taking action. Don't jump and say, we got to do this right away. Obviously there's a huge problem, you got to deal with it, but take the time to really do a proper mapping of what you have in place, what's missing, how you're in compliance, how you're not in compliance. And this requires an investment. It does, but the payoff is substantial because you avoid all those surprises. You avoid this whack-a-mole kind of feeling. And ESG, the last thing I want to mention is ESG is not a replacement for a sound business strategy. You can't just do ESG and all of a sudden your business is going to do really well. It needs to go hand in hand with your business strategy, the products and services you sell. And ESG is really there to drive the organization forward, to give you those bearing points that you can always keep in mind as you're making decisions. But ESG, as far as we can tell at Nimonik, is not going anywhere. If anything, it's going to grow in importance, and it's going to absorb some of the elements of EHS and risk management and compliance. So I hope that was helpful. Just another slide with some of our customers, and a big thank you for attending today. If you have any questions, please put them into the questions panel on the right-hand side. If you'd like to reach out to us, please send us an email, or give us a phone call. And I think we had one more poll that we'll do before I jump into the questions. So let me launch this one. So this question was, does your organization use ESG requirements to drive operational improvements? So are you seeing, are you taking what the ESG agencies and standards are asking for, and then trying to push that through the organization to actually make improvements? Or are you still in a phase where the ESG is sort of detached from operations and it's really just a reporting and, tick the box type of exercise? I'll be curious to see if people feel that this is being propagated through their organization, or if it's still just sitting at the top, detached from everything. So we'll give everybody 30 seconds to answer this, and feel free to put in questions into the questions panel, and we'll get to those in a moment. All right, let me close this poll and share the results. So over 50% of people said that ESG is driving operational improvements at their company. So that's great. Very happy to see that, and hopefully that will grow. But 36% were saying not yet, or no. And then 9% weren't sure. So still work to be done, but 55% is already pretty good, and hopefully that number will get to 100% in the next few years. Okay, great. So in terms of questions, again, please feel free to put in your questions on the right-hand side. There's handouts. So we have one question here that's, is there, I'll just rephrase it a little bit, but are there standards from regulatory authorities to ensure implementation of ESG requirements? So the short answer is it's an emerging thing. The SEC set up a task force, the SEC in the United States, which often is the leader on securities issues around the world. They set up a task force in 2021 after Biden's election, and they've already published some information, but most people in the ESG community, compliance community, are anticipating that in 2021, they're going to actually issue a more formal framework that will allow companies to sort of certify their ESG position. Right now, it's still a little bit of the Wild West with all these different standards and the lack of inspections and audits and consequences for falsifying data. So we do expect the SEC to publish something next year. In Europe, there's already been some activity, but nothing, to my knowledge at least, super comprehensive. So we'll see how it evolves, but I think inevitably for publicly listed companies, there's going to be requirements being put out by the regulatory authorities to ensure implementation of ESG requirements. So that's what we anticipate seeing. And it's still very segmented, of course. Governments still have a environment ministry and a health and safety ministry and other things, labor. So it's still a very fragmented situation. And I think that's where the financial regulatory authorities have a role to play, is bringing this all together in a more comprehensive and holistic vision. So does anybody else have any other questions or items that I can try and clarify today? Please pop them into the questions panel. We will share a copy of this video tomorrow, and the slides will be made available online, so you're welcome to share those with your colleagues and contacts. All right, so I think there's no more questions coming in. If anybody would like to reach out to Nimonik, please don't hesitate to do so. There is an exit survey at the end of this webinar, so when you leave the webinar, you'll be prompted to fill out an exit survey. We'd really appreciate if you could do that. We're always trying to improve the way we do these webinars, and if you'd like to be contacted by somebody at Nimonik, please do let us know. So that exit survey, if you can take, I think it takes like 30 seconds to complete, that would be greatly appreciated. So we have one more question. So yeah, to increase your knowledge of ESG, for sure, the presentation here, we have footnotes in terms of links to different resources, and perhaps I'll collect a list of reports that I've found to be helpful around ESG and trends. So I'll share that with everybody via email. I'll put it in a blog post with some links to reports that we can find. Audits and standards, yeah, I mean, there's links to all these ESG standards. There's a whole bunch of them, frankly, and audits. That one I'm a little bit less, I don't have any audit reports or anything I can share with anybody, but I can link to the standards and what have you in the blog post. And in this presentation, there's links, which I'll include as we send that out tomorrow. Okay, great. Well, I really appreciate everybody joining this morning. I hope you have a great day. And if we can be of any help here at Nimonik, please don't hesitate to reach out. Have a great day. Bye-bye, everybody.